Joe Patmore, Joepatmore.
Great. And how old were you during the 1964 flood?
33.
Okay. I'm going to have you answer in complete sentences because we're going to take me out of it. So if you could say, I was 33 in the 1964 flood.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was 33 years old at the 64 flood.
Okay. And I am noticing you're rocking a little bit. Is that okay? Just a little bit of rock looks okay?
We're on
Okay.
manual focus.
Well, let me just do this, and then I think we'll be
And only about this much. It's not really.
It's not
Yeah.
too much. And
I think it'll be
Stop you
okay.
right
I think our focus
That'll
is
Our focus
at
is
least
good.
this deep,
Okay.
2 feet deep.
Okay. That's good.
Yeah, I think we're good.
He's on the back end of it.
So Joe, you've had a couple of experiences with floods, and I'd like to start with your experience in the 1955 flood.
Yes, my parents were living across the river at that time, and their house would end up being on an island as the river rose, so they were trapped in the house, and they had to leave in rowboats. And my cousin Pat Harden also lived there, and he didn't quite make it past the apple trees, and so he was in an apple tree with the water surrounding. So my brother and I took our boat and went back to try to rescue him, and the boat hit a underwater branch and flipped over. And so I always heard, that the boat hits you on the head, so I dove down and come back up, and the bottom of the boat was coming at me again, so I went down again, and the boat hit an apple tree, and it made an eddy, and it just brought me right up in the middle of that apple tree. So there we were. My brother and cousin were in one tree, and I was in the other. And there we were in 10 feet of water around and very swift. And so friends at Southwark found out they had a helicopter in Wheelock, and they went over there and commandeered that, and so they picked us out of the trees with a helicopter. And they picked me out first and let me down at Southwark. Picked my cousin out and let him down. Then they picked my brother up, but they were almost out of fuel, so they went on down the river with him still hanging from the helicopter. Went out of sight. They took him to Fortuna, and so he was 2 or 3 days getting back home.
Was he in the basket in the helicopter, hanging from the basket?
No, just put a collar around under your arms and just hold you up. So he was just dangling in the air, basically.
How long were you in the apple trees before they finally came?
Oh, my brother and I were probably about 2 or 3 hours. My cousin had been in longer than that because he wrecked when they first tried to leave from the place. So he was in the tree for several hours.
Oh my gosh, crazy.
Yeah.
And now, was it your aunt it was your mom, wasn't it, who was watching from the bank when you guys went out there to rescue?
Oh, everybody was over on the other side. My folks had come around. At that time, that railroad trestle was passable, so they were able to walk over and get over to Southwark by coming around that trestle. So that worked good in 55.
Now, in 64, where were you in the 1964 flood?
Well, I lived in Fortuna by then. And so my folks had built a new house, and it was out of the range of the 55 flood, and also it was on a sloping ground so that I knew they could get out if they had to. And so with the railroad trestle there, wasn't real concerned because I thought, well, as soon as the water goes down, they can walk across the trestle. Well, then 2 days later, the trestle was down.
Yeah.
And so then I knew they couldn't get out of there. So I went to the airport, and the Army was there with helicopters, and so they took me out with a helicopter, and we landed out there. And I found out they were using the freeway bridge across the South Fork of the Eel River as a landing place. And there was a guy by the name of Peak that was for the PG&E would happen to be there, and he knew my parents had gone up on the hills with some people who lived all winter up in the hills there. And so he told me where they were. But the helicopter wouldn't go up there because it was foggy and cloudy. So they left me out at the bottom of the hill, and I walked up and stayed overnight. It was like Christmas Eve, and stayed overnight, and the next morning we walked back down to near the river where they could land the helicopter, and they flew us back to Fortuna. And that was about the end of that.
How about any friends? Did you have other friends who were impacted by the flood?
Oh, everybody in Southwark. I've aunt lived there and friends, and it wiped all their houses away. Pretty much ruined little Southwark. There's not anything there anymore. It's all gone. What houses were above the flood line, the Pacific Lumber Company owned the land, and they finally just burned down or whatever, what houses were left, and there's no one there anymore.
Let's see. Did you have any, did you help out with any of the relief work that happened after the flood?
No, I didn't really know.
And where were you working at the time?
I had a logging truck, and so in the wintertime we were off of work anyway. So,
How did the flood affect your business?
well, it didn't really, because by the time the logging season opened in the spring, why the things were pretty well back in function. They had managed to repair the bridges and so forth.
So you were able to get your timber out of the area?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions you guys want to ask? Or anything you think I should follow up on?
Did you have some follow-ups?
Yeah, I would like to cross-examine.
Okay.
Hey, Joe, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the time of the flood. You know, when it seemed to be raining all the time. Do you have a remembrance of that, of you know, how the weather kind of led up to the actual flood?
Well, in the '64 flood, living in Fortuna, we knew it was raining, but we didn't realize how hard it was down in the headwaters is where it rained. I think they said it rained 17 inches in 24 hours down by Laytonville and like that.
Go below.
Yeah, well, yeah, Branscombe is where they actually stated that it rained that much. But in Fortuna, we didn't realize it was raining that hard. Well, in the '55 flood, I knew it was raining. I went up to Wheelot the evening before to eat dinner in a restaurant, and the water was up to the curbs on the sidewalk. I had to pull up in the service station to get out of my car and go in the restaurant to keep from wading in the water. And it was really raining hard locally that time. But in '64, I don't remember that we realized how bad it was raining, because it, I think, was a little more to the south or something.
Yeah, I was just curious. And when you lived here in Fortuna, where did you live exactly?
Down on Summer Street. It's right in front of Lawndale, down in the south end of Fortuna.
Oh, am I making noise?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I mean when you're following up with.
Yeah. As far as I heard from Cliff Clendenin, the water only came up kind of 12th Street a little bit there, and so it didn't get to. Did it fill up Spring Street?
No, it didn't get over the railroad track there like by the cider works quite, I don't think.
Okay.
But I was thinking about that. If it got over that way, that would actually flooded back in a lot of the area back in there. But
Yeah.
I know in the gap down there where the new shopping mall is now, they was like about 6 or 8 feet of water over the road in that gap there.
So when you helped your parents, they went up to the higher place. Did they go back to their house to see what it was like after the flood?
It was moved. It was sitting down on top of a stump down a couple 100 feet from where it had been built. And they did go back and got some food out of it, canned goods and stuff, because they were over there for a couple of days. They were planning on walking across that railroad trestle, and it stayed there for a couple of days after the water went down before it actually fell down. So they got up that morning and were going to come across the trestle and get out of there, and they got down there and looked, and no trestle. So then they walked up the hill to where these people lived on a little ranch, stayed overnight with them.
Did they end up rebuilding there?
They sold the property, and there was another house built there, yeah. The guy built it up on posts that they had room for a garage underneath it, and the house was about 12 feet off the ground probably.
Do you recall how deep the high water mark was right down there? Because I thought I heard it was over the bridge at Dyerville.
It may have been over, I don't know, it was up on a railroad trestle enough that there was debris in the track part, because my father said, well, he took an axe. He said he thought he might have to chop stuff out of the way so they could get across the trestle. It was in their house up to about almost up to the ceiling when it tore it loose from the foundation and then floated down to the end of the property, sort of, and there was a fence and a stump and stuff, and it ended up sitting on top of that.
Think about all the people who had to go back to their homes that maybe they weren't completely destroyed and had to clean them out.
Yeah.
That had to be a mess.
Well, actually, after that '64 flood, there wasn't many houses left. Like the whole area of Pepperwood was gone, and most of Holmes Flat. All the downtown was gone. Myers Flat was pretty much wiped out. That was really a extreme flood. They talk like 1,000 years, but I think it had been longer than that. Because when we built, folks built their new house where they built, there was big redwood stumps there, and we put dynamite and blew them out. And there was no river silt in around their roots anywhere, so I don't think the river had ever been up over that area before. But out where the river had gotten over it, when you blew the stumps, there was always a little silt in around the roots and whatever, but there wasn't any in those stumps back there, so I don't think the water had ever been there. So it was quite a flood.
It was.
Yeah. I mean, when you go to other areas, you can't believe. In Weot, there's a sign almost at the top of the power poles where the water level was. And in different places, you see a sign along the highway, high water mark 64. Way 10, 12 feet up. It's really amazing wherever you were, you knew it was higher, but you really couldn't visualize how high it was in other places until you got out there and began to look.
So Joe, could I ask you about, I know it was when the '64 flood hit, it was around Christmas time. Do you have some memories about that particular Christmas and how that affected your family?
Well, in '64, I left home on Christmas Eve and went out to save my folks, so I wasn't even home on Christmas Eve and then come back Christmas Day. But, I mean, it pretty well sort of took the holiday away because there was so much else going on. The '55 flood, we ended up, there was some houses left in Southfork at that time, my grandparents' old house, and everybody sort of congregated there, and there had been a railroad cookhouse, but they salvaged a lot of the food out of there, and the cook come, and he come to my grandmother's house, and that's where people sort of ate and hung out for the first 2 or 3 days after the flood, until they started getting the roads open. That was the bad part of '64, is you couldn't get anywhere. 36, the bridges were out. Highway 101, the bridges were out. North and south, you couldn't get out of here except by airplane. So that made it really hard in '64.
I noticed you live in a very high part of Fortuna. Is that on purpose, having been through the flood?
No, the house was for sale and we liked it, so we moved up here, but we have thought of it since. Well, even with tidal waves, probably we'd be up high enough. Yeah.
So, any other questions?